Late last week, the Trump administration snuffed out pollution limits on planet warming greenhouse gases, including emissions from tailpipes and power plants. The president called it the largest deregulatory action in U.S. history. Opponents don't disagree necessarily, but they say it's potentially catastrophic folly as well. Shortly after the announcement, I had a chance to sit down with the former chief of the Environmental Protection Agency's Office of Air and Radiation, Joe Goffman. We were joined by longtime Jacksonville journalist John Burr, who has spent years studying resiliency and climate change and is a board member of the local Sierra Club. Joe Goffman, John Burr, thank you so much for being here, both of you. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having us, and nice to meet you, John.
So, Joe, can you start just by telling us what the Trump administration did late last week? What is the rule that they revoked, and what did it require?
The rule that they revoked has actually been on the books for 17 years. And what it basically said was that a mix of greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide, which comes from cars, trucks, and power plants, methane that comes from oil and gas operations, and four other pollutants, when they are emitted to the atmosphere and stay there, they cause the earth to heat up, and they're doing it at such a great scale that it's really disrupting the climate. And that's basically what the action taken in 2009 called the endangerment finding concluded. And it was based on what I would call a mountain of science when that finding was made in 2009. Now, once that finding is made, that triggered provisions in a pollution law called the Clean Air Act. And the first of those provisions that it triggered was the provision requiring the EPA to set greenhouse gas emission standards in terms of what was coming out of the tailpipes of cars and trucks. And the EPA did that for the first time in 2010. Did it continually in the ensuing 15 years. And the most recent of these standards, which were certainly tighter than the 2010 standards, were issued in 2024. So basically, once it was determined, again, based on science, that these so-called greenhouse gases were presenting a threat to public health and to the environment, EPA followed through on its Clean Air Act legal obligation to clean up cars and trucks. And to this point, those standards, those requirements have been quite successful. The cars and trucks on the road now are a lot cleaner than they were 15 years ago.
And so this is a finding, a scientific finding. How is that different from it just being a policy of the Environmental Protection Agency? And how does that matter in terms of reversing it?
Well, this finding is embedded in a statutory law, the Clean Air Act. And the finding was essentially ordered by the Supreme Court in 2007. The Supreme Court basically said, you've got this obligation under this statute that Congress passed, even back then, it was decades ago, that Congress passed decades ago, to look at the question of whether these particular gases are causing a problem for the planet, causing a problem for human health, causing a problem for the environment. And you essentially have to make this, you have to look at the question of whether these gases are dangerous. And EPA followed its legal obligation that was both stated in the statute and stated by the Supreme Court. And essentially the finding was a legal obligation that the EPA had to make. Now, there's a lot of connective tissue between that finding and another set of obligations that once you've determined that these gases present a problem, EPA has another set of obligations to actually require cars to reduce those emissions and eventually power plants and the oil and gas industry, for example, to reduce those emissions as well.
So you spent more than 4 decades working on clean air policy, both in and out of government. You helped write and implement the Clean Air Act. You worked directly on the endangerment finding. Does this reversal mean that the Trump administration is disputing the science? Because it's my understanding that perhaps an earlier draft of this reversal more directly attacked the science. Is this happening? And is instead now more focused on whether it's appropriate for the EPA to regulate these emissions.
That's exactly right. And what happened was that they issued this finding, this repeal of the finding in draft form last summer. And part of the proposal was a discussion of their view that there were problems with the science and that, in fact, the original finding was not valid, it was not legitimate because there were problems with the science. Well, what happened after that? The National Academies of Science and a number of other scientific organizations responded to the proposal. And the National Academies of Science issued a report that really, I would say, pulverized the agency's proposal and actually came to the conclusion that science since 2009 reinforced at this point beyond dispute, and that's the National Academy's language, that the science is sound, and even more so that there are observable changes in the climate and in the atmosphere that are causing real damage to Americans. This is probably a good point to try to capture what climate change means. To put it in really simple terms, climate change makes bad events worse and makes them more likely to happen more frequently. So you're going to see stronger hurricanes. You're going to see more flooding and more devastating flooding. You're going to see bad air get worse. You're going to see people's reaction, the human health reaction when climate change, when in a disrupted climate, you're going to see health effects and health experience and health outcomes get worse. Climate change is a sort of pernicious force multiplier. That's what the science says. That's what we're seeing now, and that's what, whether you're looking at the science of 2009 or the science of the fall of 2025, that's what the science and real life experience is telling us.
So when he was asked about this reversal, the head of EPA, Lee Zeldin, had a couple of comments he was making. This was after the announcement with the president. One of the points that he made was that this is going to bring savings. He kept mentioning $2,400 savings on new vehicles for Americans, and more than $1 trillion in savings to industry. But I want to play a clip that CBS News had from an interview that was right after this announcement with Zeldin. Let's take a look and a listen.
The Earth has not warmed. We're having this conversation in February 2026. The predictions of where we would be right now in this moment on global warming and sea level rise today is not where the predictions were in 2009. What they did in 2009 was use the most pessimistic assumptions and guesses. They had a choice. I want to know what the weather is going to be in DC 7 days from now. I turn on the forecast. I don't want to know that it's going to be anywhere from 38 degrees and 54 degrees.
So he went on to basically expound on that, his sense that the predictions were not precise enough as part of the reason that he thought that the finding was flawed. What's your thought on that?
My thought is it would probably take an hour to take apart those statements. They're wrong because it's almost on a different subject. First of all, since 2009, a lot of industries and governments around the world have made major progress in reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So if, as is the case, predictions going forward about what's been happening, what's going to happen are a little less dire, it's because things have changed since 2009. Now, what the administrator is citing indirectly is, in part, the science that was part of the EPA's proposal last summer. And it's precisely that proposal that got taken apart and refuted by the National Academies of Sciences. So he's relying on discredited, I would even say disreputable scientific claims. The other problem is that the endangerment finding was not about the weather. It was about the climate. It was about this global system that, as I've said, is already causing problems that we wouldn't otherwise have had if it weren't for these greenhouse gas emissions.
Well, to be
that we'll continue to have.
Yeah, I mean, to
over
be
a long
fair
period of
and
time.
to be clear, I think his point about I want to know precisely what the weather is going to be wasn't reducing the climate argument to weather, but simply saying that the predictions regarding climate change and global warming were imprecise.
Well, again, one way to think about this is that nobody has been claiming that you'd get an absolutely precise outcome. The range of outcomes is from bad enough for us to need to do something about it to even worse. Within the range that the administrator is criticizing is nothing but the kinds of events and outcomes, the kinds of impacts that we want to and actually need to avoid.
So when they shifted from attacking the science in their early draft to attacking the appropriateness of the Environmental Protection Agency regulating greenhouse gases, obviously they were making a strategic decision there. Do you think that is is it likelier to hold water in court challenges? Basically, they're saying there's not this mandate to regulate, that the EPA didn't individually test each of these contributing gases to determine how much climate change they're producing, or whether the U.S. is producing enough in this global environment to be, warranting regulation, whether it's, significant enough of a producer, those kinds of challenges.
Well, despite what the administrator said in that clip, they absolutely did surrender on the science, and so now the final action, in contrast to the proposal, is simply a set of legal arguments. So they've walked away from their false claims of last summer about the science. Here's the thing: when the endangerment finding came out, when the greenhouse gas emission standards for car tailpipes came out, those actions were challenged. And the first court of appeals that they went to, the District of Columbia Circuit Court of Appeals, in a sweeping opinion, upheld the endangerment finding and upheld the tailpipe emission standards. The Supreme Court at the time didn't even take that up on appeal. And so basically, as we lawyers say, all of these issues have already been litigated. In addition, the original Supreme Court case that determined that, yes, indeed, EPA has a legal obligation under the Clean Air Act to analyze whether these gases present a problem, and if they do, to take action to reduce them. Basically, all the arguments that the Supreme Court addressed in Massachusetts versus EPA back in 2007, that's the name of the case, are being presented to the courts all over again in last week's action. So the question is, well, I think the DC Circuit will treat this as something they've already resolved. The question really is, has the court changed so much in the last 17 years, or really the last 18 or 19 years? Has there been so much change since 2007 that a new group of justices will decide to change what the court did 19 years ago. If you read what the EPA has written, it looks like they're trying to ultimately go back to the Supreme Court and say, we're giving you all, a new court, a chance to rethink this issue. And so while I think in the Circuit Court of Appeals, these actions will be struck down, I think it's far more uncertain what the Supreme Court of 2026 will do, as opposed to what the Supreme Court of 2007 did.
Certainly, we know that they have reversed on some major decisions other than this. John Burr, I want to bring you into the conversation because one of the things that Joe talked about was the impacts of more intense storms. Certainly, resiliency has been an area that you've been very active in for many years now, even before you were on the board of the Sierra Club. So what is the challenge in this area when it comes to planet warming gases, and what, if any, effects are we seeing from it?
Well, the city of Jacksonville is really concerned about what we call compound flooding. And that is exactly what we saw during Hurricane Irma here in 2017, where you have flooding coming in from the ocean from a high tide or even worse, a surge event from a storm. You have water coming down St. Johns River from central Florida from heavy rainfall there, and you also have heavy rainfall locally. So the river actually gets plugged up, and none of this water coming into the St. Johns can go anywhere. So it spreads out into neighborhoods, and you saw that downtown. You saw that in Riverside. You saw that in San Marco. All had historic flooding during Hurricane Irma. So that, as from a resilience point of view, is a job that the city is very focused on.
And how has Sierra Club been targeting local polluters that figure into this pollution matrix overall? I know that the combating coal has been a big focus in recent years with JEA and its power supply. What portion of it is using coal or something even dirtier like pet coke?
Yes, we have a campaign at Sierra Club right now going on. We're trying to get JEA to eliminate their burning of coal and pet coke, which are the two really dirtiest types of fuels you can use to generate electricity. The other half of the campaign is to get JEA to get more aggressive in adopting solar power. They've done a little on that score, but there's much more to do. And of course, solar power emits no carbon dioxide. It's a clean fuel. It's also, once you set up the system, you're not paying fuel costs for natural gas or coal. So it's ultimately a cheaper, cleaner way to produce electricity.
In terms of this administration's priorities, this is obviously a big one. Joe Goffman, this is something that the president has said, and many of his spokespeople have echoed. This is the largest regulatory rollback in U.S. history, obviously quite consequential. And there's been some reporting on the 4 Trump administration members who have been really central to reversing not just this environmental rule, but others. And one of them is an interesting attorney named Mandy Gunasakara. She is known in D.C. in part for handing a snowball to Oklahoma Senator James Inhofe back in 2015. It was sort of a moment on the floor where he was presenting this snowball. I just want to take a look back at that clip and then talk about it.
In case we have forgotten, because we keep hearing that 2014 has been the warmest year on record, I asked the chair, you know what this is? It's a snowball. And that's just from outside here. So it's very, very cold out, very unseasonal. So here, Mr. President, catch this. Mm-hmm.
So that moment, he's obviously trying to demonstrate, yes, it still gets cold. Global warming is a hoax. That's the kind of language that we've heard echoed by this administration. the president has called it a hoax. He's called it a fraud. But it was interesting, even then, the senator called it unseasonably cold when he was holding up this snowball. And I guess I wonder if you could explain why arguments about is it cold or is it not cold perhaps fail to get the point of what the impacts of climate change are.
Well, it's really important to pay attention to a detail that when you ask a scientist or people who've worked in this area what the problem is, they really use the term climate change very, very precisely. The mechanism by which the climate is being changed is increased forced heating in the environment or in the atmosphere. But the phenomenon that we're talking about really is climate change. And an even more precise way of putting it is climate disruption. So areas that are colder than the historical average, or areas experiencing what the senator called unseasonable cold, that's actually, in many cases, not just consistent with climate disruption, it's a form of climate disruption. I think some of your viewers might have heard of the term polar vortex. That's when unusually cold air from the North Pole gets pulled way down south into the continental United States, which had only happened very rarely in the past. That phenomenon is becoming more frequent. Why? Well, there are a number of reasons, random reasons, but there's also a very specific reason, and that is the climate disruption that we're already seeing. So again, the polar vortex is the kind of thing that over time happens, but now it's more likely to happen more frequently, and when it does happen, to persist for a longer period of time and do more damage.
John, I'd ask you to comment on that as well.
Well, I would just say, while politicians and Lee Zeldin want to question the climate change or whether it exists, here in Florida, the insurance industry has already decided it definitely does exist. The average homeowner cost for home insurance in Florida is $7,500 a year, compared to a national average of $2,700 a year. That's directly related to the increased risk of hurricanes and big storms, which is also directly related to climate change.
So in terms of, industry, it is kind of interesting that this is happening at this point because it is many, and certainly like car manufacturers, utilities seem, Joe, to have come to an understanding about the realities of climate change and the necessity of adjusting their business model to reducing their emissions. Even some in the auto industry opposed parts of this reversal. They wanted to see the reversals on tailpipe emissions, but not necessarily on greenhouse gas emissions from fixed polluters like power plants. And, most of these companies have worked into their model going forward and understanding that they're going to have to reduce those emissions. So how do you see, what is the motive as you see it for this reversal if even some people that might benefit from it aren't necessarily advocating for it?
Well, I think this really is a kind of paradox, because it seems as if the motivation for these actions really is, as you say, not so much coming from industry as it's coming from people who just have an ideological commitment to oppose establishing regulations to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. If from the perspective of automakers, back when in 2024, when the Biden EPA proposed the standards that are now being wiped from the books, the auto industry, including both the Detroit Three and overseas companies that sell cars in the United States, were generally supportive of what the Biden EPA standards did. In fact, even before 2024, companies like GM and Ford were making major investments in shifting to cleaner vehicles that used electrification technologies. The other thing that's going on is, the auto industry is really a global industry. Even companies who are headquartered here in the States function globally. And the rest of the world and the rest of the auto industry is shifting very much towards electric vehicles and plug-in hybrid electric vehicles and hybrid electric vehicles. They're cleaner, they're cheaper to run, they're cheaper to maintain, and they give the consumers in the marketplace more choice. Nobody's forcing car companies to make EVs. Nobody's forcing people to buy EVs, for example. But now, instead of just being stuck with gasoline-powered engines and the fluctuating cost of fuel, consumers around the world have the choice to shift away from those kinds of engines and run their cars more or even completely on electricity.
And so I don't want to make you go too far down the legal rabbit hole here, because it's a whole different set of considerations. But lawsuits are expected. There's already a number of groups that are saying that they're going to, sue over this. And it sounds like it could complicate matters for instance, polluters. Because if the EPA is no longer the target of lawsuits, if it is no longer the regulatory agency that is in charge of setting the rules and guidelines, whether someone believes they're strict enough or not, now those lawsuits could be targeting the actual auto manufacturers, the actual utility companies. Can you talk about what that might mean, how and how that might impact enforcement one way or the other on this change?
Well, the logic and even the beauty of having a central place, that is the federal EPA, that could lay out what the requirements and expectations are or were for clean cars or clean power plants, is that it gave industry, it gave utilities, it gave the auto industry the ability to look at over a long period of time what kind of investments they needed to make, and how to plan so that they could really put great products in the market and continue to make money. Now I think we're looking at chaos, because what's likely to happen is that cities and states that are suffering damage as a result of climate change, and John described a very real, very poignant example of that, are going to sue the emitters of greenhouse gas emissions. And that includes oil companies, potentially power companies, certainly car companies. They're going to sue them for damages, sue them for the costs of having to deal with the consequences of climate change. On top of that, there are definitely states in this country, particularly states with large cities that are still dealing with air pollution and air quality problems, that are going to be writing their own rules for what's required from cars and trucks. And suddenly if you're an automaker, you're going to have this patchwork of lawsuits, and you're going to have this patchwork of state-based regulations, which are going to all come in to fill the vacuum that the EPA has now created.
This is not the only target of this EPA administrator. Lee Zeldin has also said that he wants to roll back particulate matter limits. Those are basically the fine particles that are often included in pollution that can lodge in the lungs. They can be very damaging to health and cause all kinds of health impacts. There's a stricter level that's been proposed, and that's something that Lee Zeldin has said he does not want to implement. In fact, he wants to roll back. So can you just, for people who aren't familiar with the particulate matter as a pollution that's regulated, tell us a little bit about it and what the concern might be about that also being reversed.
Well, particulate matter, which is a technical term, is basically soot. That's the way to think about it. But a lot of soot is invisible. These particles are very small, and it's what makes them particularly dangerous, because the smaller they are, the deeper they can go into your lungs and even get into your bloodstream. They are kind of like climate change. They're really sort of force multipliers for toxic pollution. They in and of themselves, particles in the lungs do real damage, particularly if they get into the bloodstream. And they also carry on them a number of toxic chemicals. I always used to say to my colleagues at the EPA when I worked there that if I only had one pollutant that I could try to reduce using our legal authorities, the one I would target is PM, is fine particles, is soot, because that's a pollutant or group of pollutants that are the most dangerous of them all, and they can affect the human body and even the mind in a number of ways. There's virtually no organ, whether it's the lungs, the heart, the brain, or other tissue, that's not vulnerable, and vulnerable in a very dangerous way to fine particles. When the Biden administration was in office, we did in fact tighten the standards for fine particles, because there had been a lot of new science about them that said that the previous standards weren't tight enough. So basically, what Lee Zeldin is doing is making, if you will, life more dangerous for Americans if and when he succeeds in loosening the standards.
It's probably worth noting, too, that this administration has also stopped measuring essentially the cost of premature death and health impacts due to air pollution. Something that EPA has traditionally tracked is sort of the cost benefit that comes from additional regulation as it pertains to the cost of healthcare. John, you wanted to make a comment?
Yes, there's another health danger in Jacksonville and in Florida that we need to talk about that's related to climate change, and that is heat. We are the expansion of the heat season here is everybody's noticed it. Let me throw a couple of statistics at you. Back in 1990, the days that we had above 95 degrees was about seven days a year. The projections are that by 2050, that's 24 years from now, we'll have 43 days of days above 95, and the health impacts of that kind of rise are substantial, especially for older people whose bodies can't adjust to the heat as well.
So I would ask you, Joe Goffman, just based on your experience with this and your knowledge of it, is there anything that people could be doing, should be doing to either prepare or push back if they're concerned about this rollback?
I think there's always a lot that people can do. First of all, they should never lose sight of how much benefit they're getting from these rules, how much benefit they would have gotten had the greenhouse gas emission standard stayed in place, how much benefit they would have gotten, how much protection they would have gotten from the tighter fine particle or soot standards. That's something that, as you said, Anne, a minute ago, Lee Zeldin is now trying to hide from people. The agency knows how to calculate the number of illnesses or deaths avoided. The agency knows how to put a dollar value to that. And oh, by the way, Lee Zeldin has cited numbers about the cost savings from removing the endangerment finding. But what he didn't tell you is that the EPA's own analysis shows that the net cost of changing those standards is higher than the cost savings. In other words, while some in the economy will be saving money, the overall economy will be losing money when these standards are taken away. What people can do, and I think John's done a wonderful job of demonstrating how to do it, is to remember that they have power not just at the federal and national level, but also at the local level. All of these problems are experienced at the local and community level. And every locality, every community has it in their power to take action at the local level, whether it's asking their communities or their local governments to adopt more measures to protect against these harms, or asking their communities or their local governments to push polluters to cut their contribution to global warming and to air pollution. There are plenty of platforms and spaces in which people can act. And of course, at the end of the day, this all works better if there's also a national government that's helping to protect people. So the next time a congressperson or even a senator has a town hall, people need to show up and remind their local representatives of how much danger we're all being put in as a result of these actions by the Trump administration.
Joe Goffman is the former chief of EPA's Office of Air and Radiation. Joe Goffman, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
And John Burr, longtime Jacksonville journalist and board member of the Sierra Club. John Burr, thank you for being here.
It's a pleasure, Ann. Thank you.